The pistol arrived in Samuel Walden's saddlebag on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879, wrapped in a piece of oiled cloth that had seen better days. Tucked beside a folded letter he had read so many times the creases had gone soft and the ink had begun to blur at the corners. And when he finally rode into the town of Ridgecreek, Texas, with the intention of delivering both the gun and the news to the widow of Thomas Keller, he had no earthly idea that the moment she opened her door and looked at him with those eyes, he would forget every single word he had rehearsed on the long, dusty ride from the Pecos River. Ridgecreek was not much of a town by any measure a reasonable man might apply. It sat in the crook between two low hills where the land flattened out and the grass grew pale and thin, and the main street ran about 400 yards from the livery stable on one end to the general store on the other, with a barber shop, a saloon, a small church painted white that was already peeling, and a handful of homes tucked behind wooden fences that the wind was slowly dismantling board by board. It was the kind of place that survived rather than thrived, where the people were tough not because they wanted to be, but because the land demanded it of them, and the sky pressed down so wide and blue above that a man could feel either very free or very small, depending on the kind of morning he had woken to. Samuel had woken to the bad kind. He had camped outside of town the night before, unable to bring himself to ride in while the sun was still setting and the light was still beautiful, because delivering news like this in beautiful light had always seemed wrong to him. He had done it twice before, once for a man named Cooper whose wife had waited in Fort Stockton, and once for a boy of 20 who had a mother in Abilene, and both times the golden hour had felt like a cruelty, like the world dressed up in its finest while someone's world ended. So he had made his camp under a mesquite tree and eaten a cold meal and watched the stars come out one by one, and he had talked to the gun in his saddlebag because there was nobody else to talk to. He had known Thomas Keller from the cattle drives, 3 seasons of riding together along the Western Trail, pushing longhorns north through the heat and the rain and the biting flies, sharing camp meals and quiet evenings and the occasional loud argument about nothing important. Thomas was a good man, straightforward, honest to the point of bluntness, quick to laugh, and devoted to his wife in a way that men on the trail rarely spoke of but Samuel had always admired. Every time Thomas pulled out the small daguerreotype photograph of Charlotte that he kept folded in his breast pocket, the man's entire face changed, softened, as though the rest of the world fell away and left only her. Thomas had died in a river crossing on the Brazos 6 weeks earlier. The water had come up fast and unexpected, a sudden swell from rains that had fallen 2 days north, and the cattle had panicked, and Thomas had gone in trying to turn a steer back toward the bank. He had been a strong swimmer, but the current had been stronger, and by the time they found him downstream he was already gone. Samuel had been the one to pull him from the water. Samuel had been the one to wrap him in a blanket and see him properly buried on a rise above the river. And Samuel had taken the pistol from Thomas's belt because it was the nicest thing the man owned and the thing he had spoken of most often, the Colt single-action Army revolver that Charlotte had given him on their wedding day, engraved on the grip with both their initials. And Thomas had said more than once that, when he was done with the trail life, he intended to hang it above the fireplace in their home in Ridgecreek. It should go back to her. That was the whole of Samuel's reason for being here. Return the pistol, deliver the letter that the trail boss had written with the details of the accident and the location of the grave, collect whatever small wages were owed, and have them sent to her along with Thomas's other belongings, and then ride on. Samuel had no particular destination waiting for him. He was 31 years old, unmarried, a man who had spent more of his adult life on the backs of horses than under any one roof, and his life was arranged around the idea that forward motion was the same thing as purpose. He would deliver the pistol. He would ride on. That was the plan. He crossed into Ridgecreek just as the morning was warming up. the sun still low enough that the shadows of the fence post stretched long across the dust of the street, and he tied his horse at the rail outside the general store and went inside to ask where he might find the Keller place. The storekeeper was a heavy-set man with a red beard and the particular look of someone who knew everything about everyone in town and had strong feelings about most of it. "Thomas Keller's wife," the man said, and his expression shifted with something that was both sympathy and caution. "Charlotte. She is out on the west side of town, the house with the blue door and the herb garden out front. You would be bringing her news, I take it." Samuel did not offer more than he had to. He said yes, he was, and thanked the man and walked back out into the morning air and stood beside his horse for a long moment with his hand resting on the saddlebag where the wrapped pistol sat. He thought about the words he had practiced. He thought about Thomas's face on those evenings when the daguerreotype came out of the breast pocket. He checked himself, straightened his coat, and led his horse down the street toward the blue door. The house was modest but well kept. The herb garden was exactly where the storekeeper had said, a neat rectangle of raised beds along the front of the porch, and even in the early spring there were things growing in it. The bold green of rosemary and the tender shoots of something he did not recognize. And the fence around the property was in better repair than most of what he had passed on his ride in, suggesting someone who had not let things fall to pieces in the weeks since she had received the news. Or perhaps had not yet received it at all. That possibility settled cold in his chest. He had assumed the trail boss had sent word. He had assumed that the letter he carried was a confirmation of something she already knew. But standing at the gate of this neat little house with its flourishing herb garden and its well-repaired fence, he began to understand that he might be arriving with the first word of it. The trail boss was not known for his speed in communications, and the mail between the Brazos country and the smaller towns of West Texas moved on its own slow schedule. He opened the gate. He walked up the 3 porch steps. He raised his hand to knock on the blue door. She opened it before his knuckles connected with the wood, as though she had been standing just inside and watching him come up the path, and the first thing he saw was her eyes. They were the gray-green color of sage after rain, and they were full of something that stopped him completely, a kind of knowing that had not yet been spoken aloud, an awareness that was already forming its worst shape before he had said a single word, and below that knowledge was a grief so enormous and so controlled that it was more terrible than any open weeping could have been. She was perhaps 28 years old, with dark hair pinned at the back of her neck and a practical dress the color of dried wheat, and flour dust on her hands from whatever she had been doing before she came to the door, and she was looking at him with those eyes, and he could not, in that moment, hand her the gun. He stood there on her porch with his hat in his hands and the saddlebag over his shoulder and everything he had rehearsed turned to sand in his mouth, and he could not find a single word, and she watched him struggle with it, and somehow that was the beginning of everything. "You knew Thomas," she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had already decided to be strong about this before she knew exactly what this was. "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said. "I did. My name is Samuel Walden. I rode with him 3 seasons on the Western Trail." She held the doorframe with one flowered hand and looked at him for a long, careful moment, and then she said, "Come inside," in the tone of a woman who was going to face whatever was coming but would prefer to do it away from the street. The inside of the house was as tidy as the outside suggested it would be, a front room with 2 chairs and a table with a lamp, a kitchen through the far doorway where the smell of bread baking came warm and steady, and on the wall above the fireplace, the empty rectangle of slightly darker paint where something used to hang and had been taken down. A rifle rack, maybe, or a mirror. He did not ask. Charlotte Keller sat in one of the chairs and looked at him standing with his hat still in his hands, and she said, "Tell me." So he told her. He told her carefully and completely, not sparing the facts but not dramatizing them either, the way a decent man delivers terrible news when he has no other option but honesty. He told her about the Brazos and the water coming up and the steer and the current, and he told her that Thomas had not suffered, which was true, and which he was grateful to be able to say truthfully. He told her about the burial on the rise above the river, and that it was a good spot, high ground with a view, the kind of place Thomas would have liked. He told her that the men on the drive had thought well of her husband, that he was respected, that his absence was genuinely felt. Charlotte did not weep while he was speaking. She sat very straight in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to every word, and when he finished she sat quietly for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, and then she said, "He was supposed to come home in September." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, because there was nothing else. "We had plans for September." She looked at the fireplace, not at Samuel. "He was going to stop doing the drives. We had enough saved. He was going to come home, and we were going to build the back room onto the house so there would be space for children." She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. "I am sorry," she said. "You do not need to hear about our plans." "I do not mind hearing them," Samuel said, and he meant it. She looked at him then quickly, as though she had not expected that answer. Something small shifted in her expression, not warmth yet, nothing so simple as that, but a slight lowering of the wall she had been holding up since she opened the door. He reached into the saddlebag then, and took out the wrapped cloth, and unwrapped it on his knee, and held out the Colt single-action army revolver, and he watched her face when she saw it, the intake of breath, the way her hand came up to her mouth, and he thought about how she had given Thomas this gun on their wedding day, and how Thomas had talked about hanging it above the fireplace, and how the rectangle of slightly darker paint on the wall above the fireplace was not a rifle rack or a mirror at all. It was exactly the size of a mounted pistol display, and he had been right about none of it and wrong about all of it, and he sat there holding the gun out to her, and found that he still could not fully extend his arm to give it over, because the moment he did, the task would be complete, and he would have no further reason to be in this room with this woman and her sage-green eyes, and her bread baking in the kitchen and her empty space above the fireplace. Charlotte reached out and took the pistol with both hands, and she held it the way you hold something that was once someone else's most beloved object, carefully, reverently, the way you hold a thing that carries more weight than its own metal and wood. She turned it in her hands and found the engraving on the grip, the initials TK and CK intertwined in the simple block letters of a craftsman who had done the best he could with what he had, and she closed her fingers around it and held it in her lap, and finally the tears came, quiet and without performance, simply present. Samuel sat with her and did not speak, and did not leave, because leaving in that moment would have been the wrong thing to do. After a while she wiped her face with the back of her hand, leaving a faint trace of flour on her cheek that she did not notice, and she said, "I will make coffee, if you will stay." He stayed. She made coffee and brought bread from the oven, and they sat at the kitchen table, and he found himself talking about Thomas the way you talk about someone you genuinely liked and miss. The real stories, the ones with embarrassing details and laughter. The time Thomas had argued for 45 minutes with a man in a supply town about the proper way to cook beans, only to concede in the end that the man was correct. The time he had fallen asleep in the saddle and woken up facing the wrong direction, and not known it for a full 10 minutes. Charlotte laughed at that one, a short, surprised sound, and then pressed her hand over her mouth as though the laugh had come out without permission, and she was not sure she was entitled to it yet. "He would want you to laugh," Samuel said, and he did not know why he said it, because it was the kind of thing people said and did not always mean, but he meant it. "Did he talk about me?" she asked, and her eyes were steady on his face, waiting. "Every chance he got," Samuel said. "He had your photograph in his pocket, and he would take it out in the evenings after supper sometimes and just look at it. The men teased him about it, but not hard, because we all knew it was the real thing." Charlotte looked down at the table. The coffee cup was warm in her hands. "He wrote to me every time we reached a town with a post office," she said. "I have every letter he ever sent me from the trail, 22 letters over 3 seasons." She paused. I was always afraid every time, every single season. I never told him because I did not want him to feel guilty for going. He knew, Samuel said. Men who are loved like that always know, I think, and it made him careful. She looked at him again, that quick, assessing look. You are a careful speaker, she said. You say things that are true but also kind. That is not easy. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she refilled his coffee cup without asking. He stayed for 2 hours that morning. He left before noon with the intention of finding himself a room at the boarding house he had noticed on his way through, spending one night in Ridgecreek, and then riding on the following morning. That was still the plan as he laid out his coin at the boarding house, and it was still the plan as he stabled his horse and walked along the main street of the small town in the early afternoon, getting his bearings out of habit rather than necessity, since he would not be here long enough to need them. He was passing the general store when the storekeeper came out onto the porch and said, "She is a good woman, Charlotte Keller. Thomas was a good man. It is a hard thing, losing a husband young." "It is," Samuel agreed. "She has been managing the property alone since he went on the last drive," the storekeeper said, with the air of someone who is imparting information that they believe to be relevant. "The back fence came down in a windstorm 2 weeks ago, and she has been meaning to repair it and has not had help." Samuel looked at the man for a moment. "Thank you for letting me know," he said, which was not a commitment to anything, and the storekeeper nodded as though it were, and went back inside. Samuel stood in the street for a moment. He looked at the pale sky and the low hills and the wooden storefronts, and then he went to the hardware section of the general store and bought nails and 2 boards, and spent the afternoon fixing Charlotte Keller's back fence. She came out to find him there around 4 o'clock, when the shadows were starting to stretch eastward, and the heat of the day had settled into a dry, steady warmth, rather than the aggressive burning of midday. She stood on the back porch and watched him hammer the last board into place, and she did not say anything right away. "You did not have to do that," she said finally. "I had the afternoon free," Samuel said, and he meant it as a simple fact, but something in the way she looked at him suggested she heard more in it than that. "Come in for supper," she said. "It is the least I can do." He came in for supper. It was a simple meal. Beans and cornbread and dried beef that she had cooked down with onions until it was tender, and they ate at the kitchen table with the evening light coming in through the window and turning everything gold, and they talked with the ease of people who have already been through something difficult together and are now on the other side of it, and finding unexpectedly that they like each other's company. She told him about Ridgecreek, about how she and Thomas had come here 4 years ago from further east, from a crowded little town in East Texas where both their families lived and where they had felt somehow squeezed, as though the life they wanted would not fit in the space available. They had wanted something with more room, more sky, and they had found it in Ridgecreek, which had more of both than most places, along with all the attendant difficulties. She had learned to keep a kitchen garden and repair the roof, and deal with the particular brand of nosy kindness that small towns offered their inhabitants without being asked. He told her about his own origins, a farm in Missouri that he had left at 17 when the farm failed, and his father had no good answer to the question of what came next. He had been drawn west and had stayed west, working cattle, doing occasional work for ranches in between drives, never quite settling anywhere long enough to put down roots. He said this without particular regret, the way you describe your own life when it has been what it has been, and you have made some peace with the shape of it, though he was aware as he said it that the shape looked somewhat empty when described in a room this warm, at a table this well set, across from a woman this present. "Do you want to settle somewhere?" Charlotte asked, and the question was purely conversational, no subtext to it. She was simply curious. "I have not decided yet," he said, which was more honest than his usual answer on the subject, which was a shrug and a deflection. She nodded thoughtfully. "Thomas wanted to settle. He would have been good at it. He was good at making things feel permanent." She said this without tears this time, with a kind of quiet acceptance, as though the grief was still enormous but she had begun the long work of carrying it rather than being crushed by it. "How long have you lived in this house?" Samuel asked. 4 years. We built it together, he and I and 2 neighbors. I held the boards while Thomas hammered. She smiled, and it was the first full smile she had given him, and it changed her face completely, opened it up, made it warmer and more alive. I was better at it than Thomas thought I would be. He kept looking at me with surprise every time I held something steady. Samuel laughed. That sounds like him. He underestimated people and then had the good grace to be delighted when they surprised him. He did, she said warmly. That is exactly right. After supper, he helped her wash the dishes without asking, just picking up the drying cloth from the hook beside the basin as naturally as if he had been doing it for years. And she washed, and he dried, and they talked about the river that ran a mile east of town, and whether it had any fish worth catching, which it did, according to Charlotte, who had caught several decent catfish in it the previous summer with a line and patience. He said he had not fished seriously since Missouri. She said she had not fished at all before coming west, but had found that she liked it, liked the patience of it, the way it required you to simply be somewhere and wait. He left before dark, because it was the proper thing to do, and because the boarding house was expecting him, and because he was not certain what was happening between himself and Charlotte Keller, but he was very certain that it was happening, and that he needed some quiet to think about it clearly. He lay in the narrow boarding house bed with the ceiling above him, and the town's small nighttime sounds coming through the window, and he thought about the pistol, which was now sitting on the mantelpiece above Charlotte's fireplace, standing in its own small slot in the bare space, where the rectangle of darker paint showed how long it had been waited for, and he thought about the weight of it in his hand when he had held it out to her, and the moment when he could not complete the motion. He thought about her eyes in that first moment at the door, the knowing and the grief and the control, and he thought about her laugh at the story of Thomas falling asleep in the saddle, surprised out of her, guilty and real, and he thought that Thomas Keller had been a very lucky man. He fell asleep thinking he would ride out in the morning and woke up knowing he would not. He was not certain what this was yet, and he did not think she was either, and the circumstances were strange, and the timing was all wrong. And yet here he was on the second morning in Ridgecreek, sitting in the same general store drinking coffee that the storekeeper had offered with the enthusiasm of a man who wanted information, and finding himself glad that the storekeeper had told him about the fence yesterday. There is also the matter of the Keller property's water situation, the storekeeper said, over his own coffee, staring at the middle distance in an elaborately casual manner. The pump at the back of the property needs a new leather seal. Thomas was going to fix it before the drive. Samuel put down his cup. Where would a man get a leather seal in this town? The storekeeper smiled the smile of someone whose plan is going well. Right here, he said. I have 2. Samuel fixed the pump that second morning, and in the afternoon Charlotte came out with a glass of water drawn from the now working pump and handed it to him, and they stood together at the back of the property looking at the repaired fence and the working pump and the small kitchen garden visible through the back window, and she said, "You are still here." "I am still here," he agreed. "Where were you going?" she asked. "When you rode in here, where were you going next?" He thought about it honestly. "I did not have a particular destination," he said. She looked at him sideways, considering. "Most men on the trail have a next destination. Most men on the trail have a reason to hurry somewhere," he said. "I did not have one." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I appreciate what you have done, the fence and the pump. You did not have to do any of it." "I know. But I wonder," she said carefully, "if you are staying because you feel you owe something to Thomas's memory. Because if that is the reason, it is a kind reason, but it is not one that would be good for either of us in the long run." He turned to look at her directly, and she met his gaze with the same clear-eyed honesty she had brought to everything since he had knocked on her door. He thought about how to answer this in a way that was both true and fair, that did not ask for anything she was not ready to give, and did not pretend to feelings he was not certain how to name yet. "I am staying," he said, "because I like being here, because your company is good and this town is as fine a place as I have passed through in a while. And because I would like to know you better if that is agreeable to you, not for Thomas's sake, though I honored him and always will, for my own." She looked at him for a long time, and then she nodded once slowly. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I can work with an honest answer." She invited him to supper again that evening, and the evening after that, and by the end of the first week he had become a regular feature of the early evenings in Ridgecreek, and the storekeeper was watching the whole thing with the satisfaction of a man who has orchestrated something and knows it. The days took on a rhythm that felt natural despite the unusual circumstances. Samuel had found day work at the livery stable, as the man who ran it was dealing with a broken wrist and needed a capable hand, and the work suited him, the smell of horses and hay and leather, the straightforward demands of caring for animals. He rose early and worked through the morning and was finished by mid-afternoon, and he would often find himself walking the long way back from the livery stable, the way that went past Charlotte's house, not always stopping, sometimes just noting the smoke from her chimney or the sound of her moving about in the kitchen garden, the way a man notes the landmarks of a place he has started to think of as his. On the afternoons he did stop, they fell into conversation as easily as though they had known each other for years. She was sharp and funny and direct, with the kind of humor that came from a person who had spent time alone and had learned to entertain herself with the absurdity of her own situation. She had opinions about everything from the best method of preserving tomatoes to the poor governance of the county, to the correct way to read a weather sky, and she expressed those opinions in the same calm, unhurried voice in which she did everything, as though certainty did not require volume. He found himself telling her things he did not usually tell people. About Missouri and the farm and his father, who had been a hard man made harder by bad luck, not cruel but not warm either, a man whose affection had existed but whose expression of it had been so muted as to be nearly invisible to a child looking for it. About the first cattle drive when he had been 23, the long nights and the boredom and the occasional terrifying burst of action, and how the land had gotten into him the way it got into certain people, not as something to own but as something to be inside of, the vastness of the Texas sky and the flat emptiness of the distances, and the way you could ride for an entire day, and the horizon would look exactly the same as when you started. He talked about how that had felt like freedom when he was young and still felt like freedom sometimes, and sometimes felt like loneliness, and that he had not always been able to tell the difference between the two. Charlotte listened to all of it with the full attention she brought to everything, not filling in his pauses with her own words but letting the pauses be what they were, and when she did respond it was always with something that showed she had heard him carefully, that she had understood not just the facts but the shape underneath the facts. "You are not used to being known," she said one evening, not unkindly, just observing. He sat with that for a moment. "No," he agreed. "I am not particularly used to it." "Neither was I before Thomas," she said. "My family was large and loud and nobody listened much. Thomas was the first person I met who actually listened." She paused. "He was better at talking than listening himself, but he tried, and the trying mattered." "It does," Samuel said. 3 weeks into his time in Ridgecreek, the livery stable owner's wrist had healed enough that he could resume most of his work, and Samuel's employment there came to a natural end. He spent a day considering what this meant for his continued presence in town, and decided it meant he needed different work rather than no work, and went to speak to the man who ran the small cattle operation on the northeast edge of town, a man named Brewer, who was looking for a hired hand with cattle experience, and said so in direct terms. The arrangement was straightforward. Samuel would work 6 days a week, live in the small room off the back of the main barn, and receive wages enough to be comfortable. It was not a foreman's position, but it was steady, and the work was familiar, and the northeast edge of town was close enough to the center of it that he could still walk the distance to the Blue Door in the evenings. He told Charlotte about the new work over supper that night, and she heard the news with an expression that she tried to keep neutral but did not entirely succeed at keeping neutral, because the news that he was staying with real, employed rootedness rather than the provisional staying of a man who might ride out any morning, produced something in her face that she did not fully intend for him to see. He saw it anyway. He did not say anything about it, because the timing was still delicate and the ground was still new, but he carried it with him the rest of the evening like a warm coal, something that gave off heat in the quiet of his chest. The grief was still with Charlotte, woven through her days in the way that real loss inhabits you, not always present in the foreground but never entirely absent, either. Sometimes when he arrived in the evening, she would be quieter than usual, turned inward, and he had learned to read the difference between the quietness that wanted company and the quietness that wanted to be respected, and he tried to give her whichever one she seemed to need. On the harder evenings, he would sometimes just sit with her on the front porch in the cooling air, and they would not talk much, and she would have the pistol in her hand sometimes, just holding it, and he understood that this was a form of connection, of presence with Thomas, and he did not feel threatened by it or impatient with it. On one of those evenings she said, "Do you think it is wrong that I am glad you are here even while I am also still mourning him?" He thought about the answer carefully. "No," he said. "I think Thomas would have wanted someone here with you. He would have hated to think of you alone in this house." He paused. "I also think that grief and gladness can exist at the same time in the same person without one canceling out the other. You are not forgetting him by being glad of company." She turned the pistol over in her hands. "He would have liked you," she said. "You are the kind of man he liked, not showy, steady." "He was the kind of man I liked too," Samuel said, "and I am sorry every day that you lost him." She looked at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was different from any of the looks that had come before, a kind of tentative opening, a reaching towards something, and he thought about how long a person had to wait before it was right to follow that reach, and decided that he was not going to rush her by one single day. The weeks moved into a month, and the month into another, and the spring deepened into summer with the particular intensity of Texas heat, dry and enormous and inescapable, the kind of heat that baked the air itself and made the distances shimmer. Samuel worked Brewer's cattle operation through the summer with the practiced ease of a man who knew cattle the way some men know music, instinctively and in his body, and he gained Brewer's steady confidence and the foreman position by the middle of July on no more formal basis than Brewer saying one morning over coffee that Samuel might as well run the operation since he already was. The summer evenings on Charlotte's porch became a fixture of his life in a way that felt so natural he sometimes had to remind himself it had only been months, because his internal sense of things said it had always been this way, said that this porch and this woman and the sound of the crickets starting up in the early dark had been part of his life for longer than the calendar could account for. The town of Ridgecreek had made up its mind about the two of them before either of them had made up their own minds. The storekeeper had stopped pretending to casual observation and simply asked Samuel directly one afternoon in August whether his intentions were serious, which Samuel answered with a look that the storekeeper correctly interpreted as confirmation, and the minister's wife stopped Charlotte after Sunday service on a morning when the temperature had not yet climbed to full brutality and said, "That Samuel Walden is a good man, Charlotte. He has the character." Charlotte had thanked her and walked home with the words turning over in her mind, not because she disagreed, but because she was still finding her way toward what she knew, still measuring the distance between what she felt and what she could act on with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She brought it to Samuel himself one evening in late August, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them and the window open to the first hint of a cooler night, the kind of hint that in Texas in August is still just a hint, but that carries the promise of September in it. "I have been thinking," she said, in the tone she used when she had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "Tell me," he said. "I think I have been afraid," she said, "of this, of whatever this is, not because I do not want it, but because wanting it feels dangerous after losing Thomas. Wanting something from a person, relying on a person, has a cost, and I paid that cost once already, and I know what it feels like, and I do not particularly want to feel it again." "That is an entirely reasonable thing to be afraid of," Samuel said. "I know it is reasonable," she said, with a trace of impatience at reasonableness. "But I am also beginning to think that reasonable is not enough of a reason to keep my distance from something that is already very close." She met his eyes across the table. "I am not asking you to make promises. I am asking you to tell me honestly what this is, what it is to you." He put his coffee cup down. He looked at her, at the sage-green eyes and the practical, capable hands wrapped around her cup and the flour dust that was, tonight as on most nights, somewhere on her person from the day's baking, and he said, "It is the most important thing in my current life, Charlotte. You are. I came here to return a pistol and I found something I did not know I was looking for, and I am not going anywhere. That is what it is to me." She let out a slow breath. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile yet, but close. "I thought that was what you were going to say," she said. "Was that the right answer?" "It was the true answer," she said, "which is the same thing for me." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and it was the first deliberate touch between them. Chosen, intentional, and it sent something through him that was warmer than the summer evening and more present than anything he had felt in years, and he turned his hand over under hers and held it. They stayed that way for a long time, neither of them speaking, because nothing needed to be said, because the conversation had arrived where it was going and could rest there for a while. September came in with a shift in the light that was particular to the Texas autumn, a quality of gold that was different from the summer's bleaching gold, softer and more slanted, and the evenings cooled to the point of being genuinely pleasant, the kind of evenings you could sit outside in without negotiating with the temperature. Samuel and Charlotte spent many of those evenings on the porch, and by October the porch sitting had become the unquestioned habit of both their lives, and the town had stopped discussing it as a development and simply accepted it as an established fact in the way that small towns accept things once they have made up their minds. He took her to a dance at the church hall on the first Saturday of October, the harvest social that Ridgecreek held every year, and it was the first time they had been anywhere together as an acknowledged pair, rather than as two people who spent their evenings at the same house. Charlotte wore a dress the color of dark red leaves and had her hair differently than usual, and when she opened the blue door and he saw her standing there, he felt exactly the way he had felt at the end of August when she had put her hand over his, that warmth, that presence, that sense of a life becoming more rather than less. They danced, which neither of them was expert at, and made each other laugh several times trying to correct their footwork, and he brought her a glass of punch and stood with her while she talked to her neighbors, and he realized somewhere in the middle of the evening that he was doing what Thomas had always done with the daguerreotype, that quiet private marveling, that interior accounting of luck that sometimes required just a moment of being looked at. Except that he was here, and it was not a photograph, and she was living and present and laughing at something the minister's wife had said, and the difference between a portrait in a pocket and the real thing was everything in the world. He walked her home after the dance in the clear October night, and at her door she turned to him with her eyes bright from the evening and said, "That was lovely," and he said, "It was," and she leaned up and kissed him on the cheek, a brief soft touch, and then went inside with a look over her shoulder that was almost mischievous. And he stood on her porch for a moment alone in the dark, and then walked back to Brewer's Ranch with the night sky enormous above him, and something very close to happiness moving through him like a current. The conversation that winter turned to the future, naturally and without pressure, emerging from a series of evenings in which the question became less avoidable, not because either of them was pushing it, but because the present had gotten so full of the two of them that it was naturally pushing outward toward what would come next. They talked about the house, about the back room that Thomas had planned to add, about the small cattle herd and whether it might grow, about the kitchen garden and how it might be expanded in the spring. And they talked around the edges of what all this meant until one evening in November when the first real cold had come in from the north, and they were sitting in front of the fireplace where the pistol hung in its place above the mantel. And Samuel said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I want you to know that is where I am. I am not asking you tonight because I want you to have all the time you need and because I want to ask you properly when the time is right. But I want you to know." Charlotte was looking at the pistol above the fireplace, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were full of something that was not sad, not anymore, not primarily, though the grief was still in there somewhere woven into everything as it always would be, as it should be. But what was primarily in her eyes was something clear and warm and decided. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "I want you to ask me when you are ready. I want you to know that." He asked her in March, 6 months after his arrival, and 7 months after the end of Thomas Keller's life on the banks of the Brazos River. He asked her in the herb garden on a morning when the rosemary was fully green and something new was already coming up in the bed she had expanded over the winter, and the sky was the pale, clear blue of the best Texas spring days, and she was wearing her work apron and her hands were dirty from the soil, and she was absolutely the most beautiful thing he had seen in 31 years of looking at the world. He did not have a ring yet, because a proper ring required a trip to the town of Monroe 40 miles east, and he had not made that trip. But he had her mother's name from something she had mentioned, and he intended to find out if the jeweler in Monroe had anything that might have suited a woman named Helen, because Charlotte had once said her mother had beautiful taste, and he thought that was the kind of detail worth knowing. He got down on one knee in the herb garden with his hat in his hand, which was where his hat often ended up when he was around Charlotte because she had the effect on him of making him feel that his hat was insufficient protection from the seriousness of her presence. And he said, "Charlotte Keller, I came to Ridgecreek to return a pistol, and I found something far more important than I came looking for, and I would like to spend the rest of my life being the man who is worthy of you. Will you marry me?" She was crying before he finished, but they were the quiet kind, the controlled kind that she had, the kind that were not dramatic but simply real, and she said, "Yes, Samuel. Yes, I will," and pulled him up from his knee with both her soil-dark hands and held his face in those hands for a moment, looking at him the way she had looked at the pistol when she first saw it, as though what she was holding was irreplaceable, and then she kissed him properly for the first time, standing in the herb garden in the morning light with the rosemary smell all around them and the Texas sky as witness. He made the trip to Monroe the following week and came back with a ring that the jeweler's wife had helped him choose, a thin gold band set with a small green stone that was the particular gray-green color of sage after rain. And when he gave it to Charlotte, she turned it in her hands the same way she turned the pistol, with a kind of reverent recognition, and then slid it onto her finger and held it up in the light and said, "It is the right color," and he said, "I thought so." And she looked at him with all of it in her eyes, all the love and the loss and the gratitude and the certainty, and he held that look the way you hold something you have waited a long time to be given. They were married in May at the Ridgecreek church, the peeling white one with the minister who told decent jokes and meant the serious parts, on a morning that was warm enough to have the doors open and the breeze coming through, and the whole town was there, because the whole town had been invested in this outcome for the better part of 6 months. The storekeeper wept openly and unashamedly in the third row. The storekeeper's wife offered him a handkerchief, which he declined because he considered his tears a personal achievement. Charlotte wore the dark red dress from the Harvest Social, which she had cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and she carried rosemary from her garden because it was in full bloom, and because she said it was for remembrance, and Samuel understood that the remembrance was for Thomas as much as for anything else, and he would not have had it any other way. Thomas was part of this story too. He would always be part of this story, and that was not a shadow but a foundation, something that had shaped Charlotte into who she was and had brought Samuel to this town and this door and this woman. They hung a second mount beside the pistol above the fireplace after the wedding. It was for Samuel's own revolver, a Remington single action that he had carried for 8 years, and that had the kind of unornamented honesty to it that his life had always had. Charlotte said it looked right, the 2 pistols side by side above the fireplace in the house that she and Thomas had built, and that she and Samuel were now making into something new without erasing what it had been. The back room got built that summer, just as Thomas had planned, though it was Samuel and 2 neighbors who built it now, and Charlotte held the boards again, and she was as good at it as she had been the first time, and Samuel looked at her with exactly the appreciation that Thomas had apparently shown, and she laughed at him for it with the same surprised delight she had shown the very first time he made her laugh in her kitchen with the coffee cups between them. In the 2nd year of their marriage, on a morning in November when the cold had come back and the fireplace was going, and the pistols were bright above it in the firelight, Charlotte told him she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment with the news settling into him, and then he stood up and crossed the room and took her face in both his hands the same way she had held his face in the herb garden on the morning he proposed, with that same reverence, that same weight of something being held that was irreplaceable, and he said, "Charlotte," and nothing else, because there was nothing else that was necessary. "In the spring," she said. "The doctor thinks March or April. That is the best time," he said. "The best possible time." "You are pleased," she said, and it was not a question, it was a recognition, and she was smiling the full smile that changed her face, the one that had appeared first at the story of Thomas falling asleep in the saddle, and that he had spent the better part of 2 years doing everything he could to earn regularly. "Extremely pleased," he said, "in the fullest possible sense of the word." The child arrived in late March, a boy, strong and loud and thoroughly opinionated about his own comfort from the first minute, with Charlotte's gray-green eyes already visible in the dark blue of new infant eyes that had not yet settled into their permanent color. They named him James Thomas Walden, and the middle name was given with intention, deliberate and loving, and when Samuel held his son for the first time in the fire-lit room with Charlotte watching from the bed and the 2 pistols visible above the mantel, he felt the full arc of how he had arrived here, the long ride from the Picos, the blue door, the eyes he could not look away from, the pistol he had not been able to hand over because something in him had already known. In whatever way, a man's instincts know things before his mind is ready to name them, that the completing of that errand would not be the end of anything, but the beginning of everything. Charlotte was a remarkable mother, which surprised nobody who knew her, and would have surprised nobody who had watched her tend her garden with patience and attention, and the particular kind of care that understands that living things grow on their own schedule, and your job is to provide good conditions rather than to force the outcome. James thrived in her care and in Samuel's, growing from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated toddler, with Charlotte's precise eyes and Samuel's dark hair, and an absolute terror of the chickens that Charlotte had added to the property, a source of great entertainment to both his parents. The chicken situation became a minor local legend after James, at the age of 2.5, locked himself in the henhouse to confront his fear of the birds, and emerged 15 minutes later covered in feathers and completely indifferent to chickens thereafter. Charlotte told this story at the Harvest Social 2 years running. It got better each time. The cattle operation grew under Samuel's management into one of the more productive small ranches in that part of West Texas, not enormously but steadily. the kind of growth that comes from careful decisions made consistently over time. Brewer had made him a full partner by the third year, which was more than either of them had expected when Samuel first took on the foreman role. The partnership suited both of them. Brewer's experience with the land and the water rights and the political knowledge of the county balanced against Samuel's cattle knowledge and his instinct for the livestock markets. And together they built something that was genuinely good. Ridgecreek itself was changing in those years, as Texas changed through the end of the 1870s and into the 1880s. The railroads were pushing further into the territory, and with them came more people and more commerce and more trouble, the usual mixture. A new saloon opened on the main street, louder and larger than the old one, and there were more disputes and more occasions for the county sheriff to ride through, and the town was slowly becoming something slightly bigger and slightly more complicated than the place Samuel had ridden into with a wrapped pistol in his saddlebag and a prepared speech that had dissolved on the spot. Some of the changes were harder than others. The Apache communities that had lived in the hill country north of Ridgecreek for generations were under increasing pressure from settlement, pressure backed by government policy that Samuel found deeply troubling the more he understood of it, which Charlotte helped him understand because she had the habit of reading everything she could get her hands on and forming clear opinions about what she read. The injustice of it was not abstract to her. It was geographical. It was visible in the hills to the north, and she had no patience for the kind of thinking that dismissed the humanity of people simply because they stood between settlers and the land the settlers wanted. Samuel shared her view, and it was one of the many things he had come to love about her, the clarity of her moral vision, the refusal to look away from uncomfortable truths, the same direct honesty she brought to everything about herself brought to everything around her as well. When a family from the Mescalero band, a man and a woman with 2 young children, came through the edge of town one spring afternoon in obvious distress, having been pushed from their camp by a group of armed men from a new ranch that had arrived from the east with more confidence than sense. It was Charlotte who opened the blue door and brought them in and gave them food and water without a moment's hesitation, and Samuel who went to find the county sheriff to document what had happened. And together, they did what small good was available to be done in a situation where the large-scale injustice was beyond the power of 2 people in one house in one small town to address, but the immediate needs of one family could be met with bread and water and a clear, witnessed account of the crime against them. The sheriff, to his credit, was a reasonable man who took the account seriously and rode out to the new ranch with the specific intention of discouraging repeat behavior. Whether it worked long-term Samuel could not say, but in the immediate it produced a settlement of sorts, and the family was able to return to what remained of their camp with the documented protection of an official report. Charlotte spoke about it for weeks afterward, not obsessively but with the steady return of a person working something through. She was angry, and she was sad, and she was grateful that they had been able to do what they did, and she was clear-eyed about the limits of what one household could accomplish against the weight of federal policy and the relentless pressure of settlement. She was equally clear-eyed that the limits of what could be accomplished were not a reason to do nothing, and Samuel agreed with her completely, and they talked about it as they talked about everything, honestly and carefully and together. This was, he thought on many evenings, the whole of what he had found in Charlotte Keller when he had come to her door with a pistol and a prepared speech, and been undone by a pair of sage-green eyes. Not just love, though the love was real and deep and daily growing deeper, but an equal, a companion in the full sense, a person who stood beside him facing the same direction and brought her own clear sight to everything they looked at together. Thomas had known what he had when he had put that photograph in his breast pocket on the long nights of the cattle drive. Samuel knew it now in the full presence of the real thing. James was 4 when Charlotte became pregnant again, and this time the doctor's estimate landed them in December, the cold end of the year, which Charlotte said was fine by her because she planned to spend most of the pregnancy by the fireplace anyway. Samuel built the fireplace up with new stone that autumn, widened the hearth, added a second layer of brick for better heat retention, and Charlotte watched him work with the expression she wore when she found him particularly attractive and was deciding whether to say so or keep it to herself. "You are showing off," she said. "I am building a better fireplace," he said. "You are doing both," she said, and went inside with a smile. The second child arrived on the 15th of December, a girl this time, with Samuel's dark hair and her own particular face that did not look like either parent and would apparently be entirely her own from the beginning. They named her Mary Helen Walden, the middle name for Charlotte's mother, the woman with beautiful taste, and James accepted his sister with the air of someone prepared to tolerate the situation indefinitely, though he had not requested it. Charlotte said this was the appropriate response for a 4-year-old brother, and that he would love her unconditionally within 6 months. She was right. It took 3. By the time Mary was old enough to pull herself around the kitchen floor, James had decided that his primary occupation in life was protecting her from the chickens, which she was not afraid of at all, which he found personally insulting. Charlotte documented this conflict in the letters she sent to her family back in East Texas, and the letters apparently provided significant entertainment because her sister wrote back requesting more detail about the chicken wars. The years settled into themselves with the richness of a life that has found its shape and his content in it. Samuel and Charlotte were not unacquainted with difficulty. They lived in West Texas in the 1880s, and difficulty was simply part of the landscape. The droughts that came every few years and required real management of the water rights and the herd, the occasional illness that moved through the community and had to be nursed through with the limited medical resources available, the ordinary losses of neighbors and friends that small communities suffered and absorbed and kept living through. But against all of this was the life they had built, the house with its blue door and its herb garden and its 2 pistols above the fireplace, the partnership with Brewer that kept them financially solid, the town that had become genuinely theirs, the children who were daily miracles of personality, and each other, the thing that underlay all the rest of it, the daily reality of being known and knowing, of choosing and being chosen. He would find her some mornings in the herb garden in the early light, before the children woke, standing among the rosemary and the sage, and whatever new thing she had planted that season. And she would have the look she wore when she was deep in her own thoughts, the private Charlotte who existed before the day made its demands. And he would stand at the kitchen window watching her for a moment before he made his presence known, not because he wanted to spy, but because he wanted to hold the image. This woman in the morning light in the garden she had tended since before he came, carrying everything she had carried and still beautiful and still standing, still growing things, still here. She would see him at the window eventually, and her face would open into the full smile, and she would say something like, "The coffee is made. I put it on early." Or, "James has been up since before dawn. I heard him investigating things." And the morning would begin, and he would carry the sight of her in the garden with him through the whole of the working day like a warm coal, the thing that gave off heat in the quiet of his chest. James, at 6, announced with complete conviction that he intended to work cattle when he was grown, and did so in such a way as to imply that this was a matter of destiny rather than choice. Samuel told him that was very fine, but that he would need to learn to read and add first, since cattle work required both, and he should know that going in. James considered this and decided reading and adding were acceptable prerequisites, and applied himself to school with the focused determination he brought to most things, which was Charlotte's determination in a smaller and louder package. Mary, at 3, had no announced intentions but was already demonstrating a marked interest in the kitchen garden, following Charlotte around the beds with a small spade of her own that Samuel had made her from a piece of wood, and digging experimentally and with great enthusiasm in whatever Charlotte indicated she should dig. and sometimes in whatever Charlotte did not indicate she should dig, which produced mixed results but which Charlotte found delightful rather than frustrating. Because she said the enthusiasm was the important part, and the aim would improve with time. Samuel watched his daughter dig with her small spade and thought about the morning in the herb garden when he had asked Charlotte to marry him, down on one knee with the rosemary blooming all around them, and thought that the garden had been here before him and would be here after many things, and that something of Thomas was still in it, in the care Charlotte brought to it, in the habits of attention she had developed in the years she had kept it alone, and that something of Samuel was in it now too. In the expanded beds of the winter after they were married, in the better fence that still stood at the back of the property, in the repaired pump that had been working for years without issue, and now in the small figure of Mary with her wooden spade, adding her own chapter to the ongoing story of this ground. In the autumn of that year, a letter came from the trail boss who had worked with Samuel and Thomas on the Western Trail, the man who had written the original account of Thomas's death that Samuel had delivered on that first morning at the Blue Door. The letter was unexpected, coming years after the fact, and it contained two things: a formal notice that a small outstanding wage that had been owed to Thomas, and then lost in the administrative confusion of the drive, had finally been located and would be sent to his widow, and a personal note that said the trail boss had thought of Thomas Keller often in the years since and hoped the widow was keeping well. Charlotte read the letter at the kitchen table with Samuel beside her, and she read it twice, and then she folded it carefully along its creases and set it in the drawer of the table where she kept the 22 letters from Thomas's trail years, the complete correspondence of a marriage conducted at a distance, the record of a man who had written every time there was a post office within reach because he had wanted her to know he was thinking of her. "He was always going to come home to me," she said quietly to the table. "He was," Samuel said. "And you came instead," she said, looking at him. There was nothing accusatory in it, nothing complicated, just the clear-eyed acknowledgement of the way things had gone, the way life moves sideways from its plans and arrives somewhere different from where you thought you were going, and how that different place can be, against all reasonable expectation, exactly right. "I came to return a pistol," Samuel said, and his voice had something in it, warmth and weight and all the years between, "and I could not hand it to you." Charlotte reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers. "I am glad you could not," she said. "I am glad you stood there on my porch with the gun in your hand and whatever happened to you in that moment happened to you and you did not just hand it over and ride away." "I thought about it," he said honestly. "After I left that morning I thought about riding out." "I know you did," she said. "I could see you thinking about it. I could see you trying to decide whether to come back." She paused. "I wanted you to come back." "You could have said so," he said, with the particular tone he used when he was teasing her. "I could have," she agreed, unruffled. "But you would not have believed me so soon. You were the kind of man who needed to arrive at things himself. I was giving you room to arrive." He laughed, genuinely and fully, and she watched him laugh with her eyes soft and warm and entirely present. And then she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the kitchen and went out through the open window into the autumn afternoon. That evening he took the Colt single-action Army revolver down from above the fireplace and held it in his hands, which he had not done since the day he unwrapped it on his knee in this same room, and held it out to Charlotte. And he looked at the initials on the grip, TK and CK, and thought about Thomas Keller on the rise above the Brazos River. On the last evening they had shared supper together before the crossing, talking about September and coming home. Charlotte came and stood beside him, and he held the gun out to her, and this time he could complete the motion. This time his arm extended fully and he held it steady while she took it from his hands, and she looked at it and then she looked at him and she said, "He would be glad, you know, wherever he is. I know him well enough to know he would be glad." "I believe you," Samuel said. She set the pistol back in its mount above the fireplace, beside the Remington, and turned back to him, and put her hands against his chest in the way she had of indicating that she wanted to be held. And he put his arms around her and held her in the firelight with the two pistols above them and the sound of the children moving about in the back room. And he stood there in the life he had found by accident and kept by choice, and felt the full settled weight of it. The full good weight of a man who has arrived where he is meant to be. Spring came again, as it always did, with the pale blue of the early sky and the bold green returning to the herb garden, and the sound of James informing Mary of important facts about cattle, that she was not yet old enough to be interested in, but was polite enough to appear to listen to. Charlotte was expecting a third child, which the doctor had told them in February, and this one arrived in August, another boy, a summer child with heat in him from the beginning, energetic and furious about everything in the gleeful way of a baby who has arrived with too much personality for his current body to contain. They named him William, no middle name required, just William Walden, and James accepted him with the air of a senior person at an institution welcoming a new member, which was to say with tolerant authority, and a list of informal regulations that William would later spend considerable energy ignoring. Mary accepted him with genuine delight, and attempted to share her wooden spade with him before he was capable of holding it, which Charlotte said showed excellent heart and questionable timing. Samuel, holding his third child in the August evening with the windows open to whatever breeze the Texas summer was willing to offer, thought that the house Thomas and Charlotte had built for two was now containing 5 with some ease and might reasonably contain more with a little expansion, and told Charlotte so, and she said that he was welcome to expand it as he saw fit as long as she did not have to hold the boards this time. She had done that twice and considered herself graduated. He expanded the house the following spring with James's enthusiastic assistance, and this time Charlotte sat on the porch and offered precise directions with a cup of coffee in her hand, and Samuel followed most of them, and the result was a house that now had not just the original front room and kitchen and back room, but a proper second bedroom for the children, and a sleeping porch off the back where Samuel and Charlotte sat on the warm summer evenings after the children were down, watching the stars come out over the pale, flat horizon of the Texas countryside, and talking about everything and nothing in the way that people talk who have accumulated years of each other. The pistol above the fireplace had become a landmark of the house, as well known to their children as the fireplace itself, an object of family mythology, the gun that their mother had given their first father, and that the man who became their second father had brought home to her, the object that was present at the beginning of everything. James, who had been told the full story in age-appropriate portions, had developed a serious and respectful relationship with the pistol, and at 12 years old asked whether he might one day take it on the drives, and Charlotte said no, firmly and with affection. The pistol stays above the fireplace, and James accepted this with the grace of a boy who understood that some things were not for movement, not for use, only for keeping. Samuel had his own relationship with the pistol by now, after so many years in the same house with it, a relationship of acknowledgement, a recognition between two things that had been in the hands of the same remarkable woman. He passed it every morning on his way to the kitchen and every evening on his way to bed, and he never passed it without a small interior nod to Thomas Keller, to the man who had deserved his life and lost it in a river crossing, to the man whose love had shaped Charlotte into someone capable of this, capable of all of it. In the October of 1887, the Walden family hosted the harvest social at their house for the first time, because the church hall had suffered a ceiling collapse from a particularly aggressive summer's worth of rain and was being repaired, and Charlotte had offered before anyone could stop her, which was typical, and Samuel had agreed before he knew what he was agreeing to, which was also typical. The result was 40 people in and around their house on a Saturday afternoon that was warm enough to be outside and cool enough to be comfortable, and the herb garden at its late season best, and the smell of Charlotte's baking drifting from the kitchen, in quantities sufficient to sustain all 40 people twice over. The storekeeper arrived first, as the storekeeper always did, and he stood in the front room and looked at the pistols above the fireplace and shook his head slowly with the expression of a man reviewing a successful investment. He had never exactly claimed credit for the Walden marriage, but had also never denied a role in it, which Samuel found both amusing and accurate. 8 years, the storekeeper said when Samuel came to stand beside him. 8.5, Samuel said. And 3 children, the storekeeper said. 3.5 as of February, Samuel said, watching the man's face shift into the wide smile of someone receiving excellent news. That is very fine, the storekeeper said, loudly enough that the minister's wife, just coming through the door, caught the tail of it and looked at Charlotte with a question on her face. And Charlotte, from across the room, smiled her full smile and shook her head at Samuel in affectionate exasperation at his disclosure method, and he shrugged from across the room in the way he shrugged when he was pleased with himself. The 4th child arrived in the spring of 1888, another girl, which pleased Mary enormously and provided James with a greatly expanded domain to supervise, and they named her Catherine Ellen, and she was, from the first week, unmistakably Charlotte's daughter in every way. The precise gray-green eyes and the particular stillness, and the already apparent habit of watching everything carefully before deciding what to do about it. Charlotte held her daughter in the firelight on the first evening home from the doctor's house where the birth had taken place, and Samuel sat beside her and they looked at this new person together, this 4th point of light in the constellation of their family, and Charlotte said, "I did not think I would have this much," very quietly, not to him specifically, more to the room, to the fireplace, to the pistols above it, to whatever was listening. "You earned it," Samuel said. She looked at him. "We earned it," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and Catherine slept between them, and the fire burned steadily, and outside the window the Texas spring was doing everything spring in Texas does, the pale blue deepening to full blue, the herb garden waking from its winter, the flat country opening up to the season. And inside this house with its blue door and its repaired fence and its working pump and its 2 pistols above the fireplace, the Walden family was complete and whole and present. All the threads of it drawn together into this moment, this warm, quiet evening, this life. James was 12 and Mary was 8 and William was 7 and Catherine was new. And the house was full in all the ways a house can be full, with noise and warmth and the particular chaos of children who are healthy and loved and uncertain about quiet. And Samuel walked through it all every day with the solid ground of it beneath his feet, knowing where he was, knowing who he was with, knowing that the long directionless years before Ridgecreek had been exactly what they needed to be to bring him here. And that here was the place that all that forward motion had been moving toward without knowing it. On a morning that autumn, he woke before Charlotte, before the children, in the pale early dark when the house was still, and the only sound was the wind moving across the roof in the way it moved across every roof in this flat country, steady and vast and unhurried. And he lay there for a moment listening to Charlotte breathe beside him, and he thought about the morning he had camped under the mesquite tree outside of Ridgecreek and talked to a gun in his saddlebag, and about the blue door, and about the moment he had first seen her eyes. He had not been able to hand her the pistol because of those eyes. He had not been able to complete the simple errand of returning an object because something in those eyes had stopped him completely, had reached into whatever part of a man recognizes the most important thing he will ever encounter and had said, "Wait, stay, look at this. This is what you have been riding toward." He rose quietly and went to the front room and stood in front of the fireplace, and in the first gray light of the morning he looked at the 2 pistols, the Colt with its engraved initials and the Remington with its plain, honest face, and he put his hand on the mantelpiece beside them and felt the realness of the house around him, the stone beneath his hand, the sleeping breath of 4 children in the back of the house, the presence of Charlotte in the room behind him. He heard her rise, heard her soft footsteps in the hallway, and then she was beside him in the gray morning, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, looking at the pistols with the particular morning calm she had, the private Charlotte who existed before the day made its demands. "You are up early," she said. "Thinking," he said. "Good thinking or bad thinking?" she asked in the tone that suggested she already knew the answer but was asking for his benefit. "Good thinking," he said. "Only good." He looked at her in the morning light, at the sage-green eyes and the flower dust that was not yet present because the day had not started yet, and the dark hair loose and the 4 children sleeping behind them, and everything that had been built between that first morning on her porch and this one, and he said, "I was thinking about the blue door." She smiled slowly, the full smile. "I thought you would ride away," she said. "When you left that first morning, I thought you would ride away." "I thought about it," he said. "But you stayed," she said. "But I stayed," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in front of the fireplace in the early morning of their life, the 2 pistols above them, the fire not yet lit, the house around them holding everything it held, and outside the window the Texas sky was beginning to do what the Texas sky did, turning from dark to gray to the first pale line of gold along the flat horizon. The promise of another day opening up enormous and unhurried above the hills, and the pale grass and the small town with its main street, and its peeling church, and its general store, where a red-bearded man had once sent a visiting cowboy to a blue door with a piece of useful information about a back fence, and everything that had followed from that, the whole long, warm, accumulated, beautiful weight of it. Charlotte Walden. He would never stop being glad he had stayed.